High above the clouds, when everything seems calm and routine, the unexpected can and does happen. Welcome to Scary Storytime, where today we're taking you on a 1-hour journey through the skies to explore some of aviation's most puzzling mysteries and most celebrated triumphs. From baffling disappearances that still linger in the mist, to legendary investigations that crack the cases wide open, we'll examine both the solved and unsolved incidents that have forever changed the way we fly. Fasten your seatbelts, because our flight plan tonight includes vanished airliners swallowed by the ocean, inexplicable onboard emergencies, miraculous recoveries against all odds, and the tireless work of experts who piece together fragments of wreckage to rewrite history. Prepare for takeoff as we ascend into the unknown, starting with the unsettling story of Flight 522 Helios. On August 14, 2005, a Helios Airways 737 with 121 people on board was circling near Athens. Investigators later uncovered a concerning history of maintenance issues with the aircraft. The plane had arrived in Cyprus just after midnight and was scheduled to take off again just hours later. During the previous flight, the cabin crew had heard loud banging noises and noticed ice on the rear service door. Shortly after landing, engineers began inspecting the problem. To check for issues with the door seal, they conducted a pressurization test using the P5 pressurization panel, which ensures that passengers have enough air to breathe at high altitudes. Normally, pressurization occurs automatically as the jet climbs, with the engines forcing air into the cabin. However, when the pressurization switch is set to manual, both the captain and co-pilot are responsible for maintaining the cabin atmosphere using a controller. During the early morning maintenance check on Helios 522, ground engineers had switched the P5 to manual mode. This allowed them to test the pressure seals on the rear door using onboard generators without starting the engines. The test indicated that no air was escaping through the back door. However, when the test was completed, the engineers failed to switch the P5 back to automatic. Several hours later, when the flight crew entered the cockpit, the pressurization switch remained in manual mode, but neither the pilot nor the co-pilot noticed this. Andreas Prodromou, a 25-year-old flight attendant who was not scheduled to work that day, took the flight to spend time with his girlfriend, who also worked for Helios. Although he was currently a flight attendant, Prodromou had aspirations of becoming a pilot for the airline. In the cockpit, the flight crew was engaged in the routine preparations for takeoff. Captain Hans Merton, an East German contract pilot hired by Helios for the busy holiday season, was working alongside his co-pilot, Pambos Karalambos, a Cypriot who had been with Helios for 5 years. Before any flight, crews must perform numerous checks on various onboard equipment, a routine but essential procedure. Helios Airways is a charter airline offering low-cost fares to Greece, and on this summer weekend, the plane was filled with families. Just a few minutes after 9 a.m., Helios Airways Flight 522 took off into the bright sunshine. Suddenly, an alarm blared in the cockpit, leaving the flight crew confused. The takeoff configuration alarm typically sounds only on the ground, indicating that the aircraft is not ready for takeoff. The crew was puzzled as to why it was sounding now. The alarm had triggered due to dangerously low air pressure in the aircraft. Although the sound was identical to the takeoff configuration warning, the crew had another opportunity to identify the real issue. At nearly 5,000 meters, the plane's master caution light illuminated and remained on for almost a minute. Unfortunately, the pilots misinterpreted the cause of this alarm as well. The master caution light can indicate overheating systems or signal that the oxygen masks are deployed. In this instance, it indicated both. However, since the crew did not believe there were pressurization issues, they focused on the aircraft's cooling systems. Consequently, after takeoff, the cabin failed to pressurize automatically. Diminishing oxygen levels may also explain some of the crew's strange behavior. Soulakis theorizes that the captain might have been checking the circuit breakers behind his seat when he and the co-pilot ultimately ran out of air. Unlike the cabin, the cockpit oxygen masks do not automatically deploy if the atmosphere thins. As Flight 522 ascended, the atmosphere became thinner, and neglecting to switch back to automatic operation posed a hidden danger. The passengers were unaware that the plane was now flying itself. They also did not realize that a limitation in the passenger oxygen system had sealed their fate. The passenger masks are supplied by a chemical generator located above their seats, which only produces enough oxygen for about 12 minutes. As Flight 522 approached Athens, it had become a ghost plane. Unsure of what was happening, Prodromou attempted to contact the flight crew but received no response. Without communication from the cockpit, he quickly recognized that this was not a typical depressurization event. Taking advantage of the additional passenger masks, he could have attempted to move to the front of the plane, a process the cabin crew referred to as monkey swinging. However, if more than 12 minutes had passed, his girlfriend and the other flight attendant might still have been in their seats, likely incapacitated by hypoxia. Hypoxia is no more painful than falling asleep, but to survive after the passenger oxygen system ceased functioning, Prodromou needed an alternative solution. The 737 was equipped with 4 portable oxygen bottles, each capable of lasting over an hour. For Andreas Prodromou, the flight must have felt like a nightmare. The Greek Air Force scrambles 2 of its most advanced fighter jets to investigate the Helios plane. However, the pilots received no response from the aircraft. One of the jets approaches the cockpit and notices someone slumped over the controls in the co-pilot seat. There is no sign of the captain. The fighter pilot observes the passengers in their seats, but none react to the presence of the jet. Suddenly, he sees movement in the cockpit. When he returns to the cockpit, the young flight attendant, who has always dreamed of becoming a pilot, calls for help. Unfortunately, no one can hear him, likely because the radio is still tuned to Larnaca, the airport in Cyprus from which the flight originated. Meanwhile, Prodromou, fighting hypoxia and struggling to control an airplane larger than any he has ever flown, finds himself in an impossible situation. Even if he could land the plane, it is now too late. Flight 522 is out of time and fuel. From an altitude of over 10,000 meters, the plane begins its descent. At 100 meters above the ground, the person in the captain's seat acknowledges the fighter jet for the first time, but no words are exchanged. Neither the fighter pilot nor local air traffic control can establish radio contact with the aircraft. Just after noon, nearly 3 hours after taking off from Cyprus, Helios Flight 522 crashes to the ground. In April 1943, a plane named Lady Be Good took off from a small airstrip near Benghazi, Libya, on a military mission to Naples, Italy. That evening, communication with the aircraft abruptly ceased, and the fate of the plane and its crew remained unknown for nearly 2 decades. When their story finally emerged, it was more horrifying than anyone could have imagined. This is the disturbing disappearance of Lady Be Good. On April 4, 1943, the world was deep into World War II, with more than 2 years still to go before its conclusion. Pilot William Hatton sat in his brand new B-24D Liberator, one of 28 aircraft from the U.S. military, preparing for its first flight with a crew of 9. His plane was assigned to the second wave of a bombing mission over Naples, Italy. The mission's instructions were straightforward: take off, join the formation with the other planes, and bomb strategic targets in the Italian harbor to disrupt supplies and reinforcements. While often overlooked in discussions about World War II, North Africa was a critical theater for both Allied and Axis forces. Fighting in the region began in June 1940 and continued until 1943, resulting in nearly 400,000 combined casualties. The geographic location of North Africa made it essential for the Allies to control access to the Mediterranean Sea, with countries like Libya, Algeria, and Egypt positioned to launch aerial campaigns against the Axis powers. If the Allies had not secured North Africa, the crucial invasion of Sicily in the summer of 1943, which contributed to the fall of Italian dictator Benito Mussolini, may never have happened. The B-24 Liberator was the U.S. military's preferred tool for aerial attacks due to its long flight range and ability to cruise at high speeds. It remains the most produced bomber in American military history, favored by generals for its capacity to fly long distances while carrying heavy bomb loads. However, airmen often preferred the roomier B-17, as the B-24 had lower ceilings and less space. The B-24 also featured the innovative Davis wing, which reduced drag and improved efficiency. Despite the B-24's capabilities, The weather conditions on April 4th were far from ideal. Strong winds and the potential for sandstorms near the Libyan coast significantly reduced visibility. After the first wave of B-24Ds took off, many pilots decided it was unsafe to continue. However, William Hatton, confident in the performance of Lady Be Good, pressed on alone. 30 minutes from Naples, William became concerned about the engine performance, suspecting it was affected by the sandstorm. Like the other planes, he decided to turn back to Saluk. Unfortunately, as soon as Lady Be Good was redirected, its automatic direction finder stopped working, leaving the crew without a way to determine their heading. With Saluk located over 700 miles southeast of Naples, finding their way back became nearly impossible, especially in the sandstorm and darkness. The crew could have navigated by sight under better conditions, but the sparse landscape of northern Libya offered few landmarks. When communication with the crew ceased, U.S. military officials in North Africa feared the worst. The next day, a search and rescue mission began, but the last known location of Lady Be Good was over the Mediterranean Sea, leading military officials to assume the plane had gone down at sea and that all 9 crew members were presumed dead. By 1958, a growing demand for oil led British geologists to scout the Libyan desert. During a flight, they spotted a debris field and soon identified it as the wreckage of a military aircraft. Initial inquiries were met with indifference, since there was no record of a missing plane. However, as more surveys were conducted, a geologist who was a friend of the airbase commander inspected the site and wrote a detailed letter about his findings, including maintenance records and crew names found on clothing inside the plane. This prompted military officials to investigate further, and in May 1959, 6 months after the wreckage was first reported, they confirmed it was Lady Be Good. A crucial mistake occurred during William's desperate call for help that night in 1943. Instead of providing verbal instructions, officials at Saluk launched flares in hopes of guiding Lady Be Good back. Unfortunately, the plane could not see the flares, and William flew past the airstrip, continuing south. For 2 hours, communication continued until the plane's radio went silent, and all attempts to re-establish contact failed. Although the military assumed the crew was lost at sea, the plane had actually crashed in the Kalankio Sand Sea, a vast, inhospitable area of 24,000 square miles with no water, vegetation, or shade. When investigators arrived years later, they found no human remains near the crash site, but the plane itself was in surprisingly good condition. It was discovered that Lady Be Good had crashed without any fuel in its tanks, and 3 of its 4 propellers were damaged, indicating they were not operational at the time of impact. There were no signs of an explosion or fire, suggesting the crash could have been survivable. The absence of parachutes led investigators to conclude that the crew had bailed out before the crash. The search expanded beyond the crash site, and about 19 miles to the north, half-buried parachutes and rubber flight boots were found, pointing toward the crew's possible path. Despite this indication, initial searches yielded no further results. Investigators continued searching for 3 months until desert conditions hindered their efforts. Eventually, the military closed the case, assuming the bodies had been buried in the sand after 15 years of exposure. Another 6 months passed before oil company employees made a shocking discovery. The remains of 5 crew members, all in military uniforms, were found scattered in a small area. Among the items recovered were flashlights, flight jackets, and parachute material. The most revealing find was the diary of 2nd Lieutenant and co-pilot Robert Toner. His entries, made between April 5 and April 9, 1943, chronicled the crew's harrowing struggle for survival. After getting lost, Lady Be Good's crew was forced to jump out of the plane shortly before it crashed. They regrouped, but only 8 men were present as 2nd Lieutenant John Warovka was missing. With no time to search for him, the remaining crew set off on foot, believing they were closer to Saluk than they truly were. They had only the clothes on their backs, minimal food rations, and a half-full canteen of water. The first day in the desert was mild, but temperatures plummeted at night, making it nearly impossible to sleep. To cope, the crew decided to travel at night and rest during the hottest parts of the day. However, as they walked, the relentless sun took its toll and they began to realize the gravity of their situation. By April 7th, the lack of food, water, and sleep was debilitating, and they prayed more than they walked. On April 9th, 5 of the crew, including William and Robert, could go no further due to exhaustion. The 3 remaining men, Harold Ripslinger, Guy Shelley, and Vernon Moore, continued on, promising to return with help. Tragically, none of them survived. After the discovery of the bodies in 1960, there was one final organized search for the remaining crew. Under Operation Climax, searchers found Guy's body 21 miles north of the previous site, and Harold's body was discovered 5 miles further in an area of towering sand dunes. John's remains were found in August 1960, 12 miles north of the crash site, revealing that his parachute had failed to deploy correctly, leading to his death. Despite extensive searches, Vernon's body was never located. The discoveries revealed a heartbreaking truth. If the crew had made different decisions, they might have survived. When they gathered after bailing out, they were just 19 miles north of Lady Be Good, which remained remarkably intact. Inside the plane were days' worth of meals, canteens filled with water, and even a thermos of drinkable coffee. The military personnel who arrived to investigate the site later discovered that the radio in Lady Be Good was still operational. Ultimately, the incident was attributed to a combination of poor visibility, navigational errors, and strong winds that carried the plane off course. The tragic fate of Lady Be Good serves as a reminder of the harsh realities of survival in extreme conditions. This is a story of unimaginable tragedy. The story of Germanwings Flight 9525. On Tuesday, March 24, 2015, an Airbus operated by Germanwings was en route from Düsseldorf to Barcelona. During the flight, the co-pilot made alarming changes to the altitude settings while the captain was out of the cockpit. He first adjusted the selected altitude to 100 feet for 3 seconds, then increased it to a maximum of 49,000 feet, before finally settling at 35,000 feet. It appeared that the co-pilot was experimenting, a behavior he would replicate on the return flight with fatal consequences. Despite these altitude adjustments, the engaged autopilot modes ensured that the aircraft's descent path remained unchanged. After the captain returned to the cockpit, the flight resumed its normal course and landed smoothly at Barcelona Airport. Shortly after, 144 new passengers boarded the aircraft, while the crew of 6 remained unchanged. The captain of this flight was 34-year-old Patrick Sondenheimer, a German national with nearly 7,000 flying hours, including over 3,800 hours on the Airbus A320 and 259 hours as a captain. For this flight, he was assigned as the pilot monitoring. The co-pilot, 27-year-old Andreas Lubitz, also from Germany, had logged more than 900 flying hours, with 540 of those hours on the A320. From a young age, Andreas had dreamed of becoming a pilot. He joined a local gliding club at 14 and obtained his gliding license 2 years later. However, his passion for flying was overshadowed by personal struggles. On September 1, 2008, he began basic training at the Lufthansa Flight Training Pilot School in Bremen. Unknown to many, Andreas faced severe depression and insomnia, even contemplating suicide at one point. He sought help from a psychiatrist and was prescribed antidepressants. His pilot training was halted when his medical certificate was not revalidated due to his condition. A few months later, Andreas showed significant improvement, as confirmed by his psychiatrist. However, a setback occurred on July 14, 2009, when his request to renew his medical certificate was denied, prompting Lufthansa to notify the LBA. 2 weeks later, he received a new Class 1 medical certificate, valid for 1 year but subject to revocation if he relapsed into depression. After passing his ATPL written exam, he continued training at the Airline Training Center in Phoenix, Arizona, from late 2010 to early 2011. Simultaneously, he worked as a flight attendant for Lufthansa for over 2 years. His determination paid off when he obtained his A320 type rating in Munich by late 2013 and joined Germanwings. By June 2014, he passed his proficiency check and became a co-pilot. Throughout his training, Andreas impressed instructors with his performance, which was considered above standard. However, by late 2014, his mental health deteriorated, leading to vision and sleep issues that required consultations with several private physicians. By early 2015, he received sick leave certificates and medication for psychosomatic and anxiety disorders. He was referred for psychiatric treatment due to suspected psychosis and prescribed additional medications, including sleeping aids. Due to patient confidentiality, Germanwings was unaware of Andreas's struggles. He continued flying, keeping his condition hidden from everyone. At 9:00 a.m. local time, Germanwings Flight 9525 took off from Barcelona Airport bound for Düsseldorf Airport. The flight path crossed the Mediterranean Sea and the French Alps, with a typical duration of 2 hours and 15 minutes. After about 30 minutes of climbing, the aircraft reached its cruising altitude of 38,000 feet, settling into a steady flight path toward its destination. According to Météo France, the aircraft was flying in clear skies, with some clouds at about 32,000 feet, and winds from the southwest at around 40 knots. At approximately 9:30 a.m., the captain acknowledged the air traffic controller's clearance to fly directly to the Irmar point, marking the last communication between the flight crew and air traffic control. The Irmar point is a designated waypoint that assists pilots in navigation and serves as a critical reference for air traffic control during airspace transitions. After the captain exited the cockpit to go to the bathroom, the co-pilot locked the cockpit door, preventing the crew from opening it using the emergency access keypad. Just 30 seconds after the captain's departure, the co-pilot adjusted the altitude from 38,000 feet to 100 feet, a maneuver he had also performed on the flight to Barcelona. However, this time it led to tragic consequences. The autopilot was set to open descent mode, and the auto thrust was set to idle, initiating an immediate descent. 2 minutes later, the co-pilot switched the speed management from managed to selected mode, allowing him to set the target speed to 308 knots. Consequently, the aircraft's speed increased, with the descent rate fluctuating between 1,700 feet per minute and 5,000 feet per minute. At that moment, no one on board was aware of the descent. However, the Marseille Control Center observed that the aircraft's altitude had dropped nearly 2,000 feet below its assigned cruise level and continued to descend. In response, Marseille attempted to establish communication with the aircraft to confirm its altitude clearance. The control center then asked, "What cruise level were you cleared for?" The co-pilot did not respond. The Marseille Control Center tried to contact the crew on a different frequency. The control center then asked another time to confirm their cruise level. No response. The controller attempted to reach the flight crew 3 more times within 30 seconds, but the co-pilot remained silent. Meanwhile, the selected speed increased to 323 knots, causing the aircraft's speed to rise again. Within minutes, the aircraft descended approximately 10,000 feet. Shortly after the speed adjustment, a buzzer sounded outside the cockpit indicating the captain's attempt to re-enter. The co-pilot did not react. The Marseille Control Center continued to try to contact the crew but received no response. The co-pilot remained silent, although the controller could hear his calm breathing. Andreas was in full control, adjusting the speed to 350 knots, the aircraft's maximum operating speed. The captain attempted to call the first officer on the intercom 4 times, but the co-pilot did not respond. Realizing the co-pilot would not open the door, the captain confronted the grim reality of the situation. Following the events of 2001, cockpit security measures were enhanced to prevent hijackings. The cockpit door, now bulletproof, separates the cockpit from the cabin and requires a standard code for entry, with an emergency code for situations like crew incapacitation. However, pilots can override this by setting the door control to lock, blocking access from outside. The co-pilot exploited this mechanism to permanently lock the cockpit door as the aircraft descended. With the door locked, the captain was unable to re-enter the cockpit. He looked through the windows and saw the aircraft descending rapidly. In desperation, he resorted to using an emergency axe to access the cockpit. Despite his efforts, the door remained impenetrable. Panic spread among the passengers as they heard the captain shouting to get the door open, causing fear to sweep through the cabin. The Marseille Control Center, along with the French air defense system, tried to establish contact with the flight crew but received no response. A French military jet was dispatched from the Orange Caritat airbase in a rapid attempt to intercept the aircraft. However, the situation had already become critical. The aircraft descended below 7,000 feet, with mountains looming closer, triggering the ground proximity warning system saying, "Pull up." Seconds later, Germanwings Flight 9525 tragically crashed into the French Alps, resulting in the loss of 150 lives from 21 different countries. Among the victims were 16 exchange students who were part of a class of 40. Only 16 spots had been available for this trip. The local fire department, civil protection rescue services, and police were dispatched immediately, but the crash site was nearly impossible to reach due to its terrain. Most personnel had to be flown in by helicopter, and it soon became evident that there were no survivors. A few days after the crash, a vigil took place in the Swiss Alps, where families released balloons into the sky, one for each victim. On March 26, 2 days after Flight 9525 crashed, Lufthansa CEO Carsten Spohr addressed a room full of cameras and families. The black box had been recovered and analyzed, shedding light on the events that transpired. During the press conference, Spohr stated, "We are deeply saddened and in total disbelief to announce that the co-pilot deliberately crashed the aircraft. Not even in our worst nightmares could we have imagined that such a tragedy would happen in our very own company." A search of Andreas Lubitz's home uncovered a hidden notification of illness. On the day of the accident, the pilot was suffering from a psychiatric disorder, likely a psychotic depressive episode, and was taking psychotropic medication, rendering him unfit to fly. Neither the airline nor his colleagues were aware of his condition. Investigators also found diary entries and an online search history, which included searches about painless poisons, methods to induce blindness, overdosing on antidepressants, death by petrol, and details about the Airbus A320 cockpit door locking mechanism. In response to the tragedy, Lufthansa provided compensation to the victims' families and continued to support them in the months that followed. A series of safety recommendations were proposed to enhance aviation security and provide better support for pilots. Initially, a temporary two-person rule in the cockpit was introduced but later revoked. Recommendations included conducting psychological evaluations for pilots, implementing random drug and alcohol testing, and ensuring stricter oversight of aeromedical examiners. Additionally, there were calls for improved privacy rules to facilitate the sharing of medical information and the establishment of a European database for aeromedical data. The final recommendation was the implementation of pilot support and reporting systems. It was determined that one reason Andreas may not have reported his worsening depression was the fear of job loss and financial repercussions. Therefore, support networks needed to be established to help pilots seek assistance and make informed decisions about their mental health without fear of negative consequences. In the aftermath of the tragedy, Captain Patrick Sondenheimer's wife founded a foundation in his memory, dedicated to helping children and young people navigate grief and crisis. He dedicated his final moments to courageously trying to save the aircraft and its passengers. On Saturday, March 11, 1967, a single-engine Cessna departed from Portland, headed for San Francisco. This flight was expected to be relatively short and routine. However, several hours in, they encountered a freak storm that caused the plane to crash on a mountainside. Miraculously, all the occupants survived the initial impact, but what they endured in the following weeks became one of the most grueling ordeals in the region's history, forever altering the course of aviation. Viewer discretion is advised as we recount their horrifying story. Alvin Ian was the proud owner of a Cessna 195, an elegant four-seater model that stood out compared to today's boxier designs. For Alvin, the plane's true value lay not in its appearance but in its potential for family bonding. He had a blended family with his wife Phyllis, who brought her daughter Carla into the mix alongside Alvin's adult sons from a previous marriage. One of those sons, 32-year-old Alvin Jr., had a layover in San Francisco, making it the perfect opportunity for the family to visit him. After all, what was the point of owning a plane if not to spend time with loved ones? At 59, Alvin had already lived a full life. He began as a lumberjack, mastering survival skills in the wilderness before becoming the owner of the Clifford Hotel in Portland. This business supported his family, allowing him to enjoy time with them and pursue hobbies like flying. He was known for being meticulous about his plane, insisting on cleaning and maintaining it himself. Joining Alvin on this trip were 44-year-old Phyllis, a nursing graduate from Northwestern University, and 15-year-old Carla, who was less than thrilled about the flight. She would have preferred to spend the weekend with her boyfriend, but Alvin Jr.'s busy schedule as a Delta Airlines pilot made opportunities to see him rare. So on March 11, 1967, they took off for San Francisco. Unfortunately, despite Alvin's experience as an outdoorsman and careful pilot, the family's survival kit was left behind. Whether it was forgotten in the rush to meet Alvin Jr. or simply overlooked, it didn't seem significant at the time. This was a short, familiar route that Alvin had flown many times before, but that would soon change. About halfway through the flight, Alvin made routine radio contact near Medford, Oregon, about 5 miles west of the city. Their next stop was Red Bluff to refuel before the final leg of their 860-kilometer journey to San Francisco. In the 1960s, navigation for private pilots was not as advanced as it is today, but one common method was the use of visual landmarks. Pilots often relied on highways, rivers, and train tracks as guides. Alvin would have done the same, using his eyes to navigate. However, before they could reach Red Bluff, the weather took a dramatic turn, shattering any sense of security. In moments, they found themselves in a full whiteout blizzard. Alvin lost all visual reference to the ground. Ice began to accumulate on the wings, and a strong wind blew them westward toward the ocean, away from the landmarks he had been following. This situation is one of the worst a civil pilot can face, known as VFR into IMC, visual flight rules into instrument meteorological conditions, which happens when a pilot relies on visual navigation in poor visibility. Despite Alvin's experience, he had no way of knowing they had drifted over 20 kilometers, 12 miles off course and into the Trinity Mountains. As harsh winds and accumulating ice forced Alvin and his family down, a mountain loomed through the storm. With no choice left, he made a hard landing on the mountainside. In most crashes, this would end tragically, but miraculously, he managed to land the plane and everyone survived the impact. Thanks to a combination of skill and luck, Alvin proved he was more than just a casual hobbyist. However, their ordeal was only beginning. Now alone and disoriented, Alvin unbuckled himself from the pilot seat to assess the situation. His first instinct may have been to check for leaking aviation fuel, but he soon realized he had a broken arm, multiple crushed ribs on his right side, back pain, a cut on his chin, and 3 gashes on his forehead. Breathing must have been agonizing, let alone moving around inside the wrecked plane. Phyllis was even less mobile, having suffered a broken left wrist and ankle, cuts on her right hand, and brain fog from a possible head injury, which severely limited her ability to assist. Fortunately, Carla, though badly bruised and shaken, was otherwise unharmed. As the only one without broken limbs, she became invaluable for their survival. Initially, Alvin likely believed they could survive with their combined skills. His outdoor knowledge, Phyllis's nursing background, and Carla's physical capability. He regretted leaving the survival kit behind, but felt they could manage. However, when he checked the plane's systems, he discovered that both radios were broken. They could not call for help, and the plane was in dire condition, overturned on its left side with smashed windows and a door that wouldn't close, allowing cold winter winds to seep in. Without the survival kit, which contained emergency food, a hunting rifle, and a flare gun, they needed help more than ever. Hours later, when the plane failed to arrive in Red Bluff, search efforts began to escalate. The Air Force, Civil Air Patrol, and Oregon Pilots Association launched a full-blown emergency response. Unfortunately, the weather continued to hinder rescue efforts, and the searchers had no idea where the plane had gone down between Medford and Red Bluff, a distance of 245 kilometers, 152 miles. If they assumed the plane could have drifted 20 kilometers off course, they would have had to search a massive 4,900 square kilometers of wilderness. Expanding that radius to 30 kilometers increased the search area to a staggering 7,350 square kilometers, most of which consisted of dense forests, rugged mountains, deep lakes, and uninhabited terrain. Unknown to everyone at the time, the plane had crashed on the north face of Bully Choop Mountain, a full 30 kilometers west of Redding, one of the navigational points leading to Red Bluff. The mountainside was covered in trees and accumulating snowfall, making the wreckage even harder to spot. Meanwhile, on the mountainside, Phyllis awoke the next morning with frostbite on her toes, and the family was in a miserable state. They must have realized that although they survived the crash, their ordeal would be grueling. All they had to eat was about 1 picnic's worth of food, a few sandwiches, 3 jars of jelly, some lemon drops, 2 bags of M&Ms, milk of magnesia tablets, and vitamin pills. While not a feast, it was something, and they smartly began rationing immediately. They also hung sheets and clothing to cover the broken windows, but maintaining some form of shelter became a constant battle against the wind. Back in San Francisco, Alvin Jr. quickly learned of the crash, given that he was expecting them. Unlike many others in his position, he was able to take action. He traveled to Redding and volunteered for the search effort, participating in search and rescue missions. This was something he had experience with from his time in the U.S. Air Force. Ironically, the family had everything they needed to survive except a working radio. As the days passed, conditions did not improve. The storm lingered, and although there were occasional breaks, full days of clear skies were rare. Search flights had to navigate around the storm's schedule, often grounding themselves or shifting their operations as new fronts moved in. On the 3rd day after the crash, Carla attempted to leave the plane to search for help, but heavy snowfall forced her back due to zero visibility. In her attempt, she also lost her shoes. 2 days later, 5 days into their isolation, Alvin felt well enough to move. However, the snow continued to fall, reaching depths that made walking more like swimming. He knew he had to try, as their food supply dwindled to the last jar of jelly. Bundling up as best he could, he set off down the mountain, hoping he was heading in the right direction. Carla and Phyllis could hear him calling back for a while as he made progress, until he shouted that he had safely crossed a gully. After that, he was out of earshot, leaving the mother and daughter to wait and hope he would find help. Meanwhile, Alvin Jr. was part of a team of 165 people, including 3 ground search teams and 45 aircraft. Despite the daunting task, he refused to give up. Day after day, in cloudy and stormy weather, he continued searching. However, another week passed without any sign of Alvin. At some point during this time, Phyllis wrote in the margins of a flight notebook that Carla had been using as a diary, expressing her worry that Alvin had not made it. By the end of the 2nd week, rescuers shared the same concern and called off the search after nearly 600 hours of flight time across hundreds of trips. Alvin Jr., however, refused to give up and continued flying search missions for an additional 8 weeks. In the meantime, Carla and Phyllis cut up the upholstery of the plane to create cards to pass the time. They also continued to engage in activities they had done with Alvin, such as making lists of foods they wanted to eat, things they wanted to do, gifts they hoped to receive, and places they wished to visit once they returned home. Holding on to hope became increasingly difficult as they endured nearly a month without sufficient food, melting ice with their body heat to drink and fill their stomachs. On April 30th, almost 2 months after the crash, Carla wrote, "This is my 16th birthday. I hope you're happy, search and rescue. You haven't found us yet." This grim entry carried a hint of sarcasm, and her birthday wish was for them to be found. In addition to these comments, Carla circled each passing day on the notebook's calendar and regularly noted the weather. In total, only 2 days after the crash had clear sunny skies. The relentless bad weather continued. On May 4th, Carla's final entry read, "It's a bright and drippy day. We are completely soaked." After that, the calendar entries stopped, and one message indicated they were becoming too weak to continue recording time, suggesting they would likely not survive much longer. Although it is unclear exactly when they died, they did perish. Their bodies lay frozen and unmoving, but their story continued. Despite surviving for at least 54 days, Alvin Jr. flew countless search missions for 107 days before he was forced to give up in late June due to dwindling savings and the need to return to work. Months later, during the first week of October, Floyd Bowling, a hunter searching for deer, stumbled upon the wreckage of the plane, buried in the trees at an elevation of 5,000 feet. The site was so dense that there was virtually no chance a search and rescue flight would have spotted them, even without 4 feet of snow on the ground. Nearby, he discovered the bones of 2 bodies scattered by animals and a book, the FAA flight log that Carla had used as a makeshift diary, detailing their time in the mountains. Alvin Jr. returned to Redding and sold the diary's contents to the Saturday Evening Post to share Carla's story. Together with his brothers, he camped at the crash site, continuing their search for their father, convinced he had to be nearby. It was only 8 miles to the nearest highway, and if he had been able to move, they believed he would have been found by then. It is unclear if this belief stemmed from journalistic embellishment or if the brothers were unwilling to admit what they likely already knew, but ultimately, they found nothing and eventually had to return to their own families. Not until September 23, 1969, nearly 2 years after the crash, did 2 deer hunters stumble upon Alvin's remains. He had made it almost to safety. His body lay just 40 feet from the road, as if he'd been following the telephone poles lining it. In a desperate bid for rescue, Alvin had arranged sticks on the ground in the shape of an arrow pointing back toward the wreckage and hung his gloves on a nearby tree, hoping a passing motorist or search plane would spot them. Yet no one did. He perished roughly a quarter mile, about 400 meters from the site of the crash, likely succumbing to the cold. Heartbreakingly, it's possible his sons walked through that same field more than once without ever seeing him. When hunters finally uncovered the scene, only tattered scraps of clothing, bleached bones, 2 moss-covered shoes, his engraved hotel pen, his glasses, and an intact camera remained. It's unclear whether any film inside survived. Alvin Jr. was scathing in his critique of the search effort, calling it chaotic, ill-equipped, and far too quick to abandon hope. He believed that had aviation regulations required emergency locator beacons, which at the time were optional and cost between $100 and $800, the plane would have been found within hours. Most of that time saving would have been spent walking the half-mile from highway to crash site. Carla's diary played a crucial role in raising awareness about aviation safety. Colorado Senator Peter Dominic read her story in the newspaper. As a former member of the U.S. Air Force, he could easily imagine the anguish of searching for his own family month after month, hoping to find them. With the support of his colleagues, including Senator Warren Magnuson of Washington State, he introduced Carla's Law, which aimed to make emergency locator transmitters mandatory in civil aviation, just as they were already required in commercial planes. In December 1970, President Nixon signed Federal Aviation Regulation 9-1.207 into law. 3 years later, it became mandatory for all civil aviation aircraft using government-funded airports to be equipped with emergency beacons. Carla's journal, along with the efforts of her family, has indirectly saved thousands of lives by ensuring that those in distress receive timely medical attention. Her poignant diary humanized a critical issue and played a significant role in addressing it. At 1 a.m. on March 8, 2014, Malaysian Airlines flight MH370, en route from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing, China, checked in with Malaysia Air Traffic Control. The last words heard from Flight 370 were, "Good night, Malaysia 370," before the Boeing 777 vanished, carrying 239 people. Now, 6 years later, the mystery of Malaysian Airlines flight MH370 remains largely unsolved, with more questions than answers. What we do know is truly shocking. Almost immediately after the last check-in, as the plane crossed from Malaysian airspace into Vietnamese airspace, it disappeared from radar screens. In the confusion surrounding the transition, it took over 18 minutes for air traffic controllers to realize the plane was missing. Ground officials attempted to reach the aircraft multiple times in the following hours, but their calls went unanswered. The distress signal alerting Kuala Lumpur's Aeronautical Rescue Coordination Center that an aircraft and its passengers might be in danger wasn't made until after 6 a.m., more than 4 hours after the plane disappeared. Initial search efforts focused on the South China Sea, but despite the involvement of 34 ships and 28 aircraft from 7 countries, no trace of the plane was found. It soon became clear that searchers were looking in the wrong area. Within days, analysis of radar and satellite data revealed shocking details about Flight MH370's final hours. After the last communication, the plane made a sudden turn to the southwest, flying back over the Malay Peninsula, then around the island of Penang before heading northwest up the Strait of Malacca and into the Andaman Sea. This maneuver took over an hour, And the most alarming revelation from the radar data was that after changing course, the plane cruised on autopilot for hours before running out of fuel and plunging into the Indian Ocean, thousands of miles from the initial search area. 3 major investigations followed the crash. Australia led the primary investigation and search efforts, as they were closest to the presumed crash site, located 200 miles southwest of Perth, and had the resources for a significant marine search. They began their efforts by air but found no trace of the plane. The time spent searching the South China Sea likely cost them any chance of recovering wreckage or the plane's black boxes. After 2 months of unsuccessful air searches, the team shifted focus to mapping and exploring the ocean floor in one of the deepest, least explored regions of the Indian Ocean. Unsurprisingly, these efforts yielded no results, and the investigation was closed after 3 years. The Malaysian police conducted an internal investigation, primarily involving background checks on passengers and crew. The results were disappointing. The 2017 report concluded that they could not determine the cause of Flight MH370's disappearance and cleared all passengers and crew of suspicion. The third official investigation was an international accident inquiry, which faced challenges from the start. International cooperation following a tragedy is difficult, and the autocratic and corrupt Malaysian government hindered a thorough investigation. It appeared that Malaysian officials wanted the situation to fade from public attention. While it is unlikely they were hiding anything nefarious, they were apprehensive about what they might uncover that could reflect poorly on their government and airline. It soon became evident that Malaysian authorities knew more about the disappearance than they revealed. A Malaysian military base had detected the plane on radar after it deviated from its flight path but failed to investigate because it appeared to be a friendly aircraft. The government withheld information about the change in flight path, allowing rescuers to waste valuable time searching in the wrong area. As time passed, more details that Malaysian officials had tried to keep secret emerged, gradually painting a clearer picture of what had happened to Flight MH370. However, due to a lack of cooperation and reliable data, the third investigation also failed to determine the cause of the disappearance and was subsequently closed. While official investigations proved inconclusive, the search for the plane continues today. Recent discoveries have led to new insights into the fate of Flight MH370. A group of volunteer engineers and scientists, calling themselves the Independent Group, studied the available data and helped narrow down the search area. By analyzing radar and satellite data, they were able to reconstruct the plane's trajectory and identify its last known location. As the plane cruised south over the vast ocean toward Antarctica, it crossed paths with a satellite, providing a general idea of its last known location southwest of Australia. Other investigators took a different approach, working backward from locations where debris eventually washed ashore, analyzing weather systems, drift patterns, and currents to trace the debris' journey and locate the plane's final resting place. This task is far more complex than it may seem, given the millions of square miles of ocean and thousands of miles of coastline in the Indian Ocean. Experts also had to contend with a phenomenon termed the Gibson effect. This occurs when searchers focus on areas where debris has already been found, potentially neglecting other areas, particularly to the north, where additional debris might exist. The Gibson effect is named after Blaine Gibson, an American lawyer and adventurer who has made it his goal to visit every country in the world. Unable to resist a mystery, Gibson has tailored his travels to assist in the search for Flight MH370. After meeting with some of the families of those lost, he decided to comb coastal areas where debris might wash up. Despite the challenge of searching for a needle in a haystack, Gibson's efforts paid off. On the advice of Australian oceanographers regarding ocean currents and drift patterns, Gibson first visited Mozambique, where he asked local fishermen about areas where they often found washed-up nets and fishing gear. Against all odds, he discovered a piece of metal that appeared to be part of a plane, later confirmed to be from MH370's horizontal stabilizer panel. More discoveries followed, and Gibson established a network of locals along the Indian Ocean coastline to bring or sell him their finds. Ultimately, He was responsible for finding 1/3 of the several dozen pieces of debris confirmed or suspected to be from MH370. In addition to the debris, Gibson often found empty purses and backpacks washed ashore alongside the wreckage, serving as haunting reminders of the lives lost. So, what have we learned in the years since the disappearance of Malaysian flight MH370? First and foremost, we can dismiss many of the conspiracy theories that have circulated online. Some claim that the unusual signals detected by radar and satellites were fabricated to disguise the plane's true flight path, although proponents of this theory fail to explain the motive behind such deception. Others, like a British tarot card reader, have claimed to have seen a missile or plane on a suicide mission, despite being nowhere near flight MH370's route. There are even those who believe the plane entered a time warp or black hole. According to William Longovesha, a writer for The Atlantic, none of these theories hold any credibility. Even less outlandish theories often ignore the satellite data and radar tracks, the aircraft systems, air traffic control records, the physics of flight, and basic geographical considerations. Moreover, numerous individuals have attempted to exploit the tragedy for personal gain, including one Australian man who claimed to have found the plane's wreckage on Google Earth. If we set aside the conspiracies and frauds, what remains? Based on the insights gained over the years, experts can make some educated assumptions about what transpired during the final hours aboard Malaysian flight MH370. We now know that the plane's deviation from its planned flight path was intentional. The tight maneuvers required for the turn would have necessitated manual operation. Afterward, the plane cruised on autopilot for 6 full hours toward Antarctica before ultimately disappearing. What likely happened in those final hours is chilling in its cold precision. Whoever was at the controls, whether it was the pilot, a co-pilot, or an unknown intruder, intentionally turned MH370 off course, set the autopilot heading south, and walked away. The jet then flew itself, mile after lonely mile, until it ran out of fuel somewhere over the remote Indian Ocean. While we may never know the full story, whether it was a deliberate act of sabotage, a tragic crime of opportunity, or something else entirely, the hard data leaves little doubt that MH370 did not vanish by accident. Its final flight was plotted by human hands, and its resting place remained somewhere on the ocean floor, thousands of feet down. The search continues, driven by the persistence of experts, volunteers like Blaine Gibson, and grieving families who refuse to let this tragedy fade into obscurity. The Babe of the Sky, the mysterious disappearance of Amelia Earhart. Amelia Earhart, affectionately known as the Babe of the Sky, was born on July 24, 1897 in Atchison, Kansas. She became one of the most famous aviators in America and around the world. Earhart was the first woman to fly across the Atlantic Ocean, both as a passenger and later as a solo pilot. However, a legendary life often has a tragic end. In July 1937, during her second attempt to become the first woman to fly around the globe, Amelia Earhart vanished without a trace. To understand her disappearance, let's rewind to March 17, 1937. Earhart embarked on her first attempt to fly around the world, accompanied by navigators Fred Noonan and Harry Manning, a skilled radio operator. Unfortunately, the trip was short-lived and plagued by problems from the start. The trio successfully flew from Oakland, California to Honolulu, Hawaii. However, their attempt to take off from Honolulu was thwarted by either pilot error or a blown tire. The incident was serious enough that when Earhart and Noonan wanted to try again 2 months later, Manning declined to join, citing the numerous issues during the first attempt. Nevertheless, Earhart was determined to succeed. On May 21, 1937, Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan boarded their twin-engine Lockheed 10 Electra, loaded with 1,000 pounds of fuel, and prepared for takeoff. They left Oakland, California, heading for Miami, Florida. The initial weeks of their journey went smoothly, with successful refueling stops in South America, Africa, the Indian subcontinent, and Southeast Asia. One significant stop was Lae, New Guinea, 42 days into their record-setting trip. With 22,000 miles already traveled and only 7,000 remaining, they were close to achieving their goal. On the morning of July 2nd, Earhart and Noonan took off from Lae, intending to fly 2,556 miles to Howland Island for their next refueling stop. Shortly after takeoff, Harry Belfer, who was in charge of radio operations back in New Guinea, began transmitting warnings about unexpectedly strong headwinds. He urged Earhart to consider their impact on fuel consumption and flight speed. Unfortunately, she did not respond, and it remains unclear if she received his messages. Around 2:18 p.m., Earhart's transmission came through. She reported flying at 140 knots and an altitude of 7,000 feet, with no concerns. An hour later, she sent another message indicating she had climbed to 10,000 feet, likely to avoid thick cloud cover. It was assumed that Earhart and Noonan were aware of the strong headwinds and were managing their fuel, which was down to about 100 gallons. As time passed, Earhart's transmissions to the Coast Guard's Itasca, stationed near Howland Island, grew stronger. The crew believed she was getting closer, prompting one operator to go outside to search for the plane. However, a critical issue arose. Earhart and Noonan could not hear communications from the Itasca. They requested the crew to use Morse code, but this also failed, leaving the aviators struggling to locate Howland Island. At 8:43 a.m., Amelia Earhart sent her final frantic transmission. "We are online, 115-7337. Tragically, the message was never repeated. The situation had shifted from an attempt to set a world record to a desperate search and rescue mission. The Itasca immediately initiated a search of the Pacific Ocean around Howland Island. 5 days later, the U.S. battleship Colorado joined the effort, followed by the USS Lexington from San Diego. The U.S. Navy even flew over Gardner Island, now known as Nikumaroro, and spotted signs of recent inhabitants. However, they found no evidence of Earhart or her aircraft. What happened to Amelia Earhart? The most straightforward explanation, believed by many, is that the aircraft ran out of fuel. Earhart had reported low gas levels in her final communications. Despite debates from skeptics who argued that the plane should have had enough fuel for 24 hours of flight, Earhart's messages suggest otherwise. The Jet Propulsion Laboratory at Caltech supports this theory, stating that the headwinds and altitude increase would have depleted the Electra's fuel. Another theory posits that Earhart and Noonan attempted to land on Gardner Island, which is located 315 nautical miles south of Howland Island. Proponents of this theory believe that they may have spotted the island at low tide and made the decision to land there. However, to date, no definitive evidence of a plane crash on Nikumaroro has been found. Interestingly, a lagoon on Nikumaroro has been suggested as a possible crash site. While the Navy found signs of human life on an uninhabited island, they did not locate the aircraft. In the following weeks, numerous people claimed to have heard radio transmissions from Earhart, pleading for help and sometimes accompanied by a male voice. These transmissions were traced back to Gardner Island, lending some credibility to the castaway theory. Adding to the intrigue, in 1939 or 1940, British colonial officer Gerald Gallagher discovered a campsite and a partial human skeleton on Nikumaroro. However, a physician later determined that the bones belonged to a short, stocky male, ruling out both Earhart and Noonan. Years later, the International Group for Historical Aircraft Recovery, TIGAR, revisited the skeletal findings. They proposed that the bones could belong to a tall woman, as Earhart was. TIGAR's director, Rick Gillespie, suggested that the remains may have been disturbed by coconut crabs, which could have moved or consumed them. Ultimately, many theories exist regarding the fate of Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan, and no definitive proof supports any of them. What we do know is that Amelia Earhart was less than 7,000 miles away from becoming the first woman to circumnavigate the globe. The mystery of her disappearance continues to captivate the world, leaving a lasting legacy for America's aviation queen. On June 1, 2009, Air France Flight 447 departed from Rio de Janeiro, bound for Paris with 228 people on board. The Airbus A330 ascended into the night, cruising smoothly over the Atlantic Ocean. However, hours later, the aircraft encountered a violent storm. Ice crystals clogged the pitot tubes, which led to the autopilot disconnecting. Confused by the erratic speed readings, the pilot struggled to regain control. As a result, the aircraft began to climb dangerously and lost lift. Alarms blared, "Stall, stall." In the ensuing chaos, the first officer inadvertently pulled the nose up instead of leveling off. For 3 harrowing minutes, the plane plunged from 38,000 feet toward the ocean below. The captain, returning from his break, attempted to regain control, but it was too late. At 2:14 a.m., Flight 447 crashed into the Atlantic, claiming the lives of everyone on board. Debris was discovered months later, but the black boxes remained missing for 2 years. The world would eventually learn that the crash was preventable, a tragic combination of faulty instruments and human error. Had the pilots recognized the stall, the aircraft might have been saved. Unfortunately, miscommunication and panic sealed their fate. On November 24, 1971, Dan Cooper was riding in the back of a plane. He called a stewardess over and showed her a briefcase containing a bomb. His demands were very simple. He wanted $200,004 parachutes. After landing in Seattle, Cooper exchanged the 36 passengers for the money and parachutes with the authorities. He then ordered the pilots to fly to Reno, Nevada during this flight. Cooper told the crew to go into the cockpit, and then he locked the cockpit door from outside. After they landed in Reno, Cooper and the bomb were nowhere to be found, and the stairway was left extended. Because at some point between Seattle and Reno, Dan Cooper jumped from the plane into the dark of night, taking the $200,000 in parachute with him. Over the years, many researches were conducted to find Dan Cooper and where he landed, but the case of Dan Cooper remains unsolved. And that brings us to the end of our flight through aviation's greatest cases. Thank you for joining me on this 1-hour flight. Fly safe, both in the skies and in life, and I'll see you on our next adventure into the world's unsolved enigmas. If you enjoyed this deep dive, please hit like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you don't miss the next journey into the unknown. Which story surprised you the most, or is there an aviation mystery you want me to tackle next? Let me know in the comments below.